Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Public Policy Forum about California high-speed rail. We're going to give it just a minute or so, less than a minute, let that room fill up, and we'll go ahead and get started with our guest speaker, Boris Lipskin. Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome. This is an exciting forum for us talking about high-speed rail. I know a lot of us are train fans and fans of the future, and San Francisco sits right in the heart of where the future is going, whether it's autonomous cars, whether it's high-speed rail, whether it's biotech and life sciences. San Francisco continues to be in the forefront, despite what you're hearing on YouTube videos about people leaving San Francisco. We've all said at the Chamber of Commerce, there's tons of talent in San Francisco that is here and here to stay. So this is part of it. I want to introduce Boris Lipkin, the Northern California Regional Director of the California High-Speed Rail Authority. Boris was appointed by Governor Edmund G. Brown, who is Jerry Brown Jr. I had to kind of figure that one out, in the summer of 2018. And as the Northern California Regional Director, Boris is leading the planning and delivery of the high-speed rail program to Northern California, the Northern California region. In this capacity, Boris has been appointed as the authority's representative on the Trans-Bay Joint Powers Authority Board of Directors. And Boris previously served in several roles with high-speed rail program in 2011. Before being appointed to the Northern California Regional Director, Boris had served as the Deputy Director of the Strategic Planning, where he led the Strategic Initiatives Office. Prior to that joining, Boris was a consultant in a strategic consulting practice called Parsons Brinkhoff, now WSP, where he helped clients resolve complex funding, policy, commercial, and strategic challenges. All of those seem to fall right into his wheelhouse right now with high-speed rail. Boris has a bachelor's degree in business economics and geography, good combination, from UCLA, and a master's degree in city planning from the University of Pennsylvania. If you have any questions for Boris, just open comments after his presentation. Please use the Q&A or the chat. And Boris, I'm going to hand it off to you. We are all very excited how high-speed rail has a great opportunity to change the landscape of San Francisco, how we use San Francisco, how the downtown core changes. So Boris, please take it away.
Thank you, Rodney, and thank you for inviting me and my team to speak here and provide an update on the project. It's certainly, we've always appreciated the Chamber's strong advocacy for both our program and in general improving the transit network that we have in the Bay Area and in San Francisco. So great to be here with you. So my presentation is going to mostly focus on our what we're calling the revised draft 2020 business plan, and this is meant to be an update on kind of where we are today. Just for one moment, to take a half step back for those who may not be familiar with the project, and though I imagine that most folks are, the voters of California had approved moving forward with a high-speed rail system connecting our major cities together, starting with what we call phase one from San Francisco to Los Angeles and Anaheim. That happened back in 2008. Of course, it includes strong commitments in terms of our travel times and making sure that the service is electrified, so it reduces our emissions and other goals that the voters had approved back in 2008. So this is more of an update of what's happened since then, where we're at, especially focused on the previous few years, as well as what's ahead and what's in front of us on the program. So if you go to the next slide, please. Just for, again, a little bit of background and starting point, we do a business plan every 2 years. This is one of our big reports to the legislature. Normally, we do these in every even year, and so we released a draft 2020 business plan February of last year. And normally, that would have been submitted to the legislature by May 1st of 2020. Of course, in the intervening time, the global pandemic hit, and so we took a few steps back to really try to understand better what the impacts of COVID would be on the program, respond to some questions that we had received from the legislature in hearings that they held, and then bring all of that analysis back in what we're calling this revised draft 2020 business plan that was released earlier last month. Right now, we're in the middle of the 30-day public comment period. As I'm talking to you here today, I think they're wrapping up the board hearing to receive oral public comment, though there's a number of different other ways to submit comments as well. And I think I have a slide on that at the end. Ultimately, the business plan itself will go to our board's next meeting for approval on March 25th, and then will be submitted to the legislature. Next slide, please. So where the business plan starts off is the impacts that COVID has had on the program. Again, that was sort of one of the main reasons why we had asked for more time and worked with the legislature and governor's office to get a little bit more time to do analysis and really understand what COVID has meant for the project. As folks might know, we have been in construction since 2015. So many of these are impacts on the construction sites. We have 119 miles currently being built. So we have had workers who have had to be quarantined, both from positive cases as well as exposures. One of our main revenue sources has been the cap and trade program, and the auctions this year, especially in May, were well below their kind of ongoing averages, and that's resulted in roughly almost $300 million less in revenue. We're hoping that that might be made up in the coming auctions, but we haven't seen that yet. And a variety of other impacts and delays across various areas. All of the bottom line kind of from COVID is that's resulted in both cost and schedule impacts on the program, and the business plan is very explicit in laying out what those have been to date, as well as the actions we're taking and the steps that will be necessary in order to continue to mitigate the risks that the pandemic poses for the program going forward. Next slide, please. At the same time, while there have been impacts from COVID, the project has continued to advance. And this is a graphic showing the number of construction workers that we have had on site in any given week throughout the last couple of years. And you can see that even with the pandemic, while lots of industries have been impacted and have faced layoffs and reductions in staffing, we have actually doubled the number of construction workers out building the system. So we started with roughly 600 folks out there per week and ended the year at about 1,200. We've been kind of oscillating around 1,100 or so in the new year. Next slide, please. Since we do these business plans every 2 years, it's important for us to sometimes have a side-by-side metric looking at kind of where we were at the previous one and where we are today. In 2018, we also had a new leadership team had come in. So our CEO has been with the agency, Brian Kelly, since that time. He had previously served as the Secretary of Transportation for California. And then, I and others were also appointed in new positions around that same period. But what we've seen in that timeline is we've doubled the number of construction workers that have worked on the program in total. So this is over the course of the construction project. We now have over 50 structures that have already either been built or are in construction today. And that was less than 20 back in 2018. We've advanced the environmental clearance across the entire system that had just been done only in the Central Valley up to that point. And of course, the bottom line metric is our monthly expenditure on construction, which is, again, sort of looking at the volume of work happening that has also more than doubled. So across all of these metrics, we're seeing tremendous progress across the entire system. Of course, this thing is massive and we have lots more work to do, and we'll talk about sort of the next steps in actually delivering and getting the system into service. Next slide, please. So that's sort of the review of what's come before. Where the business plan goes from there is what's coming up next. And so one of the key policy recommendations from the business plan is in terms of what do we do with the work that's under construction today, and how do we move that towards getting high-speed trains actually running in California. And so the business plan reaffirms the recommendation that we had made previously to start an initial operating segment in the Central Valley, extending from the 119 miles that are under construction today to 171 miles getting into downtown Merced and downtown Bakersfield. So what we kind of refer to as getting out of the fields and into the cities down there. That segment is entirely environmentally cleared already, and it has the highest ridership potential for the various options of how we put the infrastructure that's being built into service in the Central Valley. We have entered into a memorandum of understanding with our state transportation agency and the San Joaquin Joint Powers Authority, which runs the ACE and San Joaquin services, to basically align all the interim service roles and responsibilities so that that service, both on the high-speed part of the line and the connecting services up in Merced, can work as a seamless system, kind of under a collective operational framework. The business plan lays out some work that we are still going to do in terms of exploring some phased track implementation. So we know that we will eventually need 2 tracks, especially as we extend to the Bay Area. But there might be some opportunities to defer a little bit of track construction and save a little bit of money in the short term, while still meeting all the service objectives for that interim service if we do partial single track with some passing sightings. And then we conducted a independent peer review of the ridership forecast for that line. This was done in response to questions that the legislature had raised. And so we brought on an outside firm to look at those forecasts, make sure that they're reasonable and that they were fit for purpose. And fortunately, the outside review found that the results were appropriate for the work that they were intending to perform for us. There are more steps to do in terms of completing that line, and so we do have work in front of us. Those are some of the next steps listed on the bottom of the slide. Next slide, please. So as we are doing the construction work in the Central Valley, and I think the map on the right is actually quite helpful and illustrative for where we have already environmental clearance, is sort of the dashed lines. Where we have some construction ongoing is the dark red. So you can see both the 119 miles and the 171 extensions. We also do have the 50 miles of the corridor between San Francisco and San Jose that's being electrified right now. As well as there is environmental clearance for a high-speed project from Las Vegas to connect all the way to our system at Palmdale. That's being led by a private party. But we are also moving forward on each of the segments on the sort of the black lines across the entire statewide system. So last year we released 4 draft environmental documents, including the 2 in Northern California, so San Jose to Merced, which is our connection to the Central Valley, as well as San Francisco to San Jose, as well as 2 in Southern California. And right now we're working on getting those completed and ultimately being able to move those forward in basically the next 12 to 15 months. In Northern California, we do have a couple sections in Southern California that will take a little bit longer and go into late 22 or into 2023. Next slide, please. So just again, focusing in a little bit on the Northern California segments, we are deep into the middle of the environmental process. We've taken a number of different steps along the way. Of course, the big one being the public review of the draft EIR-EIS that happened last year. We are now working on responding to all of the comments. In parallel, we will be coming back out with some recirculated materials. These will be limited changes, primarily focused on some changes in regulatory treatment of certain endangered species, in the San Jose to Merced project section, and a couple other things in San Francisco, San Jose as well. But we'll be taking that in parallel, getting any additional comments on those components, and then ultimately making any changes that are necessary, responding to all the comments from the public review, and then bringing that back to our board of directors, as I mentioned, in early 2021 it's early 21 now, so early 22 for San Jose to Merced, and then early a little bit later in 2022 for San Francisco, San Jose. Next slide, please. Other components from the business plan, there's a big focus on risk, and as I mentioned, with COVID, we have certainly come to appreciate the various risks that are facing a project of this magnitude, including the ongoing effects of the pandemic itself. And so we've both already taken into account the cost impacts that the pandemic has had on the project and the construction work, as well as we propose to increase our risk contingency amounts to cover the ongoing effects of the pandemic. We've also established an enterprise risk management system to help us manage and more thoroughly understand all the risks involved, and have sort of a centralized committee that handles our risk profiles and what we are doing in terms of mitigations to address those. And then we've also established what we're calling a stage gate process for project development and delivery. The diagram on the bottom is a representation of that process and policy. I'm not going to try to go through every step of it, but the main highlights are this very systematic approach for how we move forward through each project segment, through development and then into delivery. Right now, the focus for Northern California is on stage gate 3, but some of the upcoming stages are really some of the lessons learned from the challenges that we faced with meeting our federal deadlines for construction work that we had to do in the Central Valley, where some of those steps were done in parallel that probably should have been done a little bit more sequentially if we had the opportunity to do so. Next slide, please. So what stage gate 3 means for us, and what the business plan proposes for the first time to put explicit funding towards. We've always sort of had the environmental clearance being the upcoming big milestone that's in front of us, and of course it still is, but now it feels within reach, and that one is of course critical for having a very explicit project and being able to move forward to things that then start to get into the real world. And so the next steps that we see beyond that are things like the geotechnical investigations that we need to do, especially in Pacheco Pass, where we will have some pretty big tunnels that we need to build. And so we need to understand the soil conditions better. And that's a very sensitive ecological set of areas as well. We need to advance the design so we can get more precise on our right-of-way mapping, starting to get into our third-party agreements for utility relocations and as well as with our jurisdictions. Really getting a better grasp on, continuing to review all the risks and costs associated with the particular project sections, and then preparing to get into construction. So this is sort of the path forward after environmental clearance. In Northern California, of course, we will need additional funding to actually build parts of the system, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But these are the critical path to even get to that point, to be prepared as those funding opportunities might present themselves, so that we are sort of front of the line in bringing the project and bringing high-speed rail to Northern California. Next slide, please. So other things that have been happening and are important, and that the business plan gets into, is the change in administration has certainly been a very positive development for us. Just before the inauguration, Governor Newsom wrote to then President-elect, now President Biden, laying out priorities for where California can partner with the new federal administration. And of course, COVID and other areas were top of the list. But amongst in his letter, he laid out a couple of different times the importance of restoring both the federal commitment to the project as well as investing in high-speed rail as one of the key infrastructure priorities that the Governor Newsom's administration wanted to work with the president and his team on. And so we've actually seen quite a bit. If you go to the next slide, please. Of positive development on that front. When we released the revised draft business plan, the acting administrator for the Federal Railroad Administration, Amit Bose, put out a very positive statement talking about California's leadership when it comes to high-speed rail. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg was on television talking about the U.S. has been we've been asking people to settle for less for too long in this country, and that we should be doing more to invest in high-speed train services and have better rail service that we can be leading the world on. And those have certainly been very positive responses back. I think the vice president, our former senator, was recently, I think yesterday, talking about high-speed rail as well. And all of that kind of amounts to things that we've asked the Biden administration to work on immediately, is starting with just a restoration of a federal partnership. We've for the last couple of years had essentially nothing but opposition and silence from the previous administration. We have been in the middle of litigation with them over a grant funding that they had tried to revoke. We're asking the Biden team to reobligate those funds. And we will be asking for a little bit of flexibility in some of our schedules and delivery, just so that we can the deadlines that we've had under our federal grants were frankly daunting before COVID. They're worse now, and so we will be asking for a little bit more time to finish the construction in a systematic and cost-effective way. And then, the big one, of course, is, this feels like the time and opportunity for increased federal investment in electrified high-speed rail. The Biden campaign was talking about sort of the Build Back Better agenda in terms of how we can invest in green technologies while also having immediate economic effects and being part of sort of the recovery from the pandemic. And we certainly see our project as fitting very well with the priorities that they have so far articulated. And we certainly see the need for the federal government to play a larger role in the funding of the project, as it has traditionally done in large transportation endeavors across the country. Next slide, please. Just a few more things from the business plan. And again, this is meant to be an overview. There's a lot more beyond what I'll cover here, but in the plan itself. From where we look at our forecasts of both funding and costs, we see through 2030 from the current available resources, roughly 20 to 23 billion of being available to the project. Our estimate to complete and get the MERCED to Bakersfield line into service, as well as make the needed statewide investments that we talked about, including completing Caltrain electrification, moving us through stage gate 3, so environmental clearance and the next steps in Northern and Southern California. All of that adds up to about 21 to 22.8 billion. So we're kind of in that range. Obviously, those numbers will continue to fluctuate as we get new cap and trade results on a quarterly basis. So we'll continue to monitor, of course, all the various funding and cost sources and uses. And then the important one here is that we will be asking the legislature to appropriate the remaining Proposition 1A funds. That's roughly $4 billion. That's needed to complete the construction that's currently underway and get that MERCED to Bakersfield line into service. If you go to the next slide, please. So we've started that process. At their last meeting, our board approved what's called a funding plan that spells out in more detail what the ask and the appropriation request entails and meets other requirements from Proposition 1A. That starts a 90-day process of ongoing discussions with the legislature about the request. It will ultimately be wrapped into the governor's revised budget, which comes out in May, and then whatever is going to be part of something will be adopted, and hopefully the request will be included in the legislator's adopted budget in June. We will have a couple pretty important hearings coming up in the state assembly, especially on March 10th, so a week from tomorrow in the morning. Where we will be talking about the business plan as well as this funding request, as well as in the state Senate on March 16th. Certainly, we would appreciate the chambers and the members supported those hearings. There have been various ideas thrown out about potentially trying to take some of the funds away and not finish the Central Valley segment. So those are going to be important milestones in that conversation, especially the March 10th one. And then ultimately, we'll need it to do another funding plan after the appropriation to get access to the funds. That's sort of part of completing the Prop 1A process. And for us, if the appropriation doesn't happen this year, we have enough cap and trade funding to get us through basically the end of 2021 in terms of construction. But as we get into 2022, we would have to start slowing down the work in order to line up with the availability of cash from the quarterly auctions of cap and trade, and obviously that will incur both additional costs, delays, and reduce the number of workers that we would have on site any given week, and have other negative impacts on the project. So we're very hopeful that this appropriation happens and we are able to move forward and continue the work in the Central Valley to get us to operating high-speed trains in California. Next slide, please. So that's the overview of the business plan. As I mentioned, the comment period is open through March 12th. There's a variety of ways that folks can submit comments on our website. There's a comment form by email, phone, and by mail. And I think if the board hearing might still be going on or might have wrapped up. So I'm not going to promise that one anymore at this point. But I think that's my last slide. So I'm happy to answer any questions and get into the Q&A discussion part of this.
Great. Thank you so much, Boris. That was a very informative presentation. And I know everyone here, is eager to get the high-speed rail up and moving. We do have quite a few questions here. So I'll just start from the top. Roland asks, maybe if we can go back to the presentation, there's a question about some of the numbers you presented on slides 5 and 6. It looks like there's about approximately 1,000 construction jobs on slide 5, but then on slide 6, there's around 5,000 jobs. Just what's the difference there?
Sure. So if you go to the previous slide, so this is on basically a weekly average of the number of folks out on the construction site on each of those. So if we have 5 days during the week, this is the weekly average for the number of folks working on during any given week. We also, and then if you go to the next slide, we also track the total number of workers who have worked on the project. So not on any given 1 week, but over the course of the construction work. And so if basically out of the 5,200 that have worked on the program during any week, roughly 1,000 of those are out on the construction site on any given week, if that makes sense.
Definitely. Thank you for that clarification. And Roland also asks a few other questions. I might just make this a broader question here. Comparing the California high-speed rail to other countries, what are some similarities and differences, especially around electrification, given that it looks like in France, they build on existing rail lines for electrification, and it seems like in California we're going about that differently. So maybe just some points of comparison there.
Sure. I think just speaking broadly, high-speed rail is a mode that requires electrification, and that's sort of the propulsion system, if you will, for the technology across the world. In many other places, and maybe this is sort of the second part of the question that you were getting at, Emily, there are places where high-speed lines might come straight to town. There are other places where they might use existing rail corridors if those are available and can sort of have compatible services and electrified networks as ways to get to downtown areas. And certainly we're doing a combination of those things similar to many other countries where we are building parts of the line that are the kind of maximum speed and full kind of high-speed rail service into downtown areas. We're also where we do have opportunities for partnerships on existing rail lines, like our project here in Northern California, like the Caltrain corridor. We have looked at and are incorporating those as part of the system design where they make sense, and where we are able to build those partnerships that in the case of Caltrain, we have helped to electrify and modernize that rail corridor for both commuter rail service as well as for the high-speed line. In some other areas, there might be existing rail corridors that we can essentially add additional tracks or electrification infrastructure into and have a shared corridor, even if we don't have shared tracks. And so we're definitely keenly aware of those kinds of opportunities and applying some of those lessons learned and best practices from other systems into what makes sense for us here in California.
Definitely. And let's see, Brendan here, similar to that question, you kind of got to that a bit, but maybe some other examples of how you're working with different jurisdictions at the train stops to plan development.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, we certainly see part of the reason what high-speed rail can do is hopefully concentrate development around the stations and have supportive land uses that both drive ridership, reduce emissions, and meet our other objectives. There was actually a great report by SPER a few years ago called Harnessing High-Speed Rail that really talked about how we could do more of that. We as an agency don't have local land use control, and so we can't change local zoning, for example, in a given jurisdiction around our stations. So the steps that we take is obviously we have policy guidance on the question that sort of what do we support and what would we like to see around our stations, and we make that very clear. We have also partnered with many of our jurisdictions to do station area planning and help them update local station area plans, and it could be like a downtown specific plan or something like that to create more supportive land uses in any given jurisdiction. But obviously those require partnerships with our communities, and we have those in many of our cities. And then of course, where we do have our own property, we do have the ability to do joint development, and those are opportunities that we will be exploring and pursuing as we continue to build out the system. So those are very, very good questions. There are certainly topics that we care deeply about, and we want our stations to be successful hubs and for economic activity. Obviously, San Francisco is probably our leading child, golden child, an example of that. And I don't need to go on about the whole neighborhood that has sprung up around the Transbay, the Salesforce Transit Center in the city. That's sort of even before rail arrives, and it's already there. So we're very lucky with our northern endpoint.
Yeah, definitely. I can say I'm actually just a block away physically right now from the Transbay Terminal. So it's been exciting to see all of that, come together. And I guess a broader question around that: are there certain roadblocks you're facing in other communities, or in tandem with that, as San Franciscans, and we love our public transportation, what are ways that we can help, to speed the high-speed rail along?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, each community is a little bit different. And so we, of course, have various questions, and sometimes it's right of way or other things that are subjects of continuing work that we need to do with our local jurisdictions. And of course, we're doing that on a day-to-day basis in terms, and San Francisco has always been sort of our hub of support, even across the entire state. And we certainly appreciate the Chamber's previous efforts in support of the project as well. I think in terms of what you can do, I would certainly encourage folks to engage in that legislative discussion on especially March 10th, that hearing. They are accepting both letters as well as public comment at the hearing, and really prioritizing the continued advancement of electrified high-speed rail. What the business plan lays out as our path forward for both how do we get that into service in California, which is a critical step that will then allow us to, of course, be looking at how we expand from there to Northern California as well as Southern California. And the work that the business plan lays out as the next pieces of that are those critical components that we would certainly appreciate support with the state legislature currently, and then ultimately I'm sure we'll be talking more as potential new federal funding opportunities might provide another advocacy avenue for how we go beyond the Central Valley and actually get construction funding to get the other segments built.
Definitely. And speaking of federal funding, Brendan asks, any indication as to how much of the 1.9 trillion stimulus would be available for high-speed rail? So
the current bill that's being debated does not have funding for high-speed rail in it. It has certain funding for public transit. Of course, public transit's been hit very hard by the pandemic, especially those agencies who've been dependent on fare box revenue, like Caltrain, have seen huge effects and drops in the ridership. And so those are funds really intended to keep those systems going. Now, what we're hearing on the federal side is that right now they're focused on this recovery bill, and of course has really important COVID-focused provisions about vaccine distribution and lots of really, really valuable things in the bill. The focus, from what we understand, for a follow-on bill will be on infrastructure and investment. And so I think that might be wrapped into the reauthorization of the federal transportation programs that expire later this year. And so I think that's the one where there will be a lot more explicit conversation and some opportunities for us to get in the game a little bit more on the federal funding side.
Great, and I'll also let our attendees here know I'll go ahead and send out more information about the March 10th hearing too, for all of those interested in supporting. You can watch out for an email from the chamber on that. And then I guess, Boris, if you don't mind, I have some more specific questions about specific routes. So I'll go ahead and dive into those.
Sure.
Roland asks, why does the authority continue to insist on the Pacheco Pass alignment? And you did mention SPER earlier, when SPER and others have known for over 20 years that the pass does not need any tunneling and offers a more direct route that saves 10 minutes to Fresno and 20 minutes to LA.
So
I can read that again too if needed.
That's okay. I think I can see it in the chat, and Roland has asked this question many times in other venues as well. So, I mean, we have looked at Panoche Pass previously as part of the programmatic environmental work that was done back in the 2008 timeframe. There are challenges in terms of even not having previous studies done for that pass. And other issues that were based on the analysis done at the time. That pass seemed to have both potential environmental issues as well as cost and other implications that led us to choose the Pacheco Pass. And of course, that's been the route for the connection between the Central Valley to the Bay Area since roughly the 2008 timeframe. So that one's pretty much, we've done a lot of work to advance that since. And so that one's a previous decision that we're continuing to push at this point.
Definitely. All right, let's see. Paul asks, how much of the materials and structures are being sourced from the US and how much from China and other countries? Will the train be US made?
Sure. So under our federal grants with the FRA, so maybe I'll even rewind a half second. So most Federal Transit Administration grants have a 60% Buy America provision as part of those. The Federal Railroad Administration, because there was a big focus as some of the funding was coming from the previous Recovery Act, the 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act out of the last recession, we actually have a 100% Buy America requirement. And so all of our materials are sourced, or components at least are sourced in the US. In terms of the trains themselves, the way that it works, they will have to be assembled in the US, and those are some of our requirements. For those, of course, there's multiple details of sort of subcomponent parts that can be brought from abroad and things like that. But the 100% Buy America requirement applies to the entire project.
And in regards to the project as well, I know you had presented to us earlier about the sustainability aspects, and I know you touched on it a bit in your report, but I was personally blown away by the even the trucks that are transporting the materials. You've thought of all of the whole train of production. So if there's any other points around sustainability that you'd like to highlight for our audience, that would be great. Sure.
Yeah, and I think this is I always love our region because I think even more so maybe than the rest of the state at times, the sustainability program that we have gets a lot of more attention here, as I think we're kind of, I would say California is leading on climate change, and I think the Bay Area is leading California at times. And so we do have a very robust sustainability program that's frankly won awards and is consistently ranked us as some of the top kind of infrastructure projects across both the country and times the world. And it's really focused on every component of what we do. So it's everything from recycling of construction materials that we have recycled over 95% of everything that we, if we demolish a building, we reuse that in the construction work, of course, itself. Similarly, we have the most stringent requirements for our fleet of construction equipment and vehicles that is what's called Tier 4 equipment being used on site. And so what that means is that we basically reduce both the criteria pollutants and greenhouse gas emissions from the construction work by close to 60%. We've offset all the emissions that the construction work has produced by planting trees and entering into basically programs that help replace all diesel pumps and other components to make sure that we're reducing emissions as we actually build out the system. And then, of course, the big push ultimately is for what the system can do, and that's kind of the really exciting part, is the service part of that question. In that, we for right now, transportation is our largest sector of emissions across the state, and it's one that continues to grow as we continue to reduce our emissions from other modes and other production components across the state. And so this is an area that we need to tackle. And the system both takes cars off the road, obviously, for longer distance trips, which are an opportunity where we have, by having faster travel time, is how we attract riders as well. And this is important, I think, reducing some of our air emissions, which is a sector that's much harder to decarbonize. We can make a lot more progress on the roadside, but taking flights off between San Francisco and LA, which is where we are going to be competitive and be able to have an impact, is really one of those big opportunities in terms of meeting our emissions goals that the system offers as we build out the entire statewide network, because those are the ones that are very, very hard to do anything with if we keep flying back and forth between LA and San Francisco.
Yeah, definitely. Well, this is definitely a very massive and exciting project. I know we have a few other questions here. They're a bit more technical. So if you and your team, maybe you want to tackle those in the chat there. And for those listening, just wanted to quickly introduce myself. I am Emily Abraham from San Francisco Chamber of Commerce, Deputy Director of Public Policy. I will drop my email in the chat if you want to get connected or learn more about how to support the High-Speed Rail Authority. Please do shoot me an email. But before we head out, I know we have Rodney Fong, our CEO of the Chamber of Commerce, and I know the Chamber cares a lot about the downtown development, in the urban center that San Francisco is. So it'd be great to hear maybe some more about how the high-speed rail can, further help San Francisco in our recovery.
Thanks, Emily. So Boris, I'm curious about San Francisco, obviously, but all the other stops, and traditionally where train stations in a large urban setting like the Transbay Terminal, but also in MERCED, in Bakersfield, what does that feel like, and what kind of commerce is driven to those cities, those towns? In a strange way, San Franciscans have never sort of had easy accessibility to those areas, and to make an easy weekend trip or a day trip is now potentially possible. So just curious your thoughts on tourism, the interaction of pedestrians up and down the state of California more easily.
Sure, yeah, I think those are great questions, and I think that's part of what we see as the transformative aspects of the project, is when we do start to tie these different cities together with fast travel. I mean, I sometimes use the example of the trip between San Jose and Fresno. Right now, that's a 3 to 4 hour drive, and so not a lot of folks, frankly, make the trip. That becomes a 1 hour trip by rail with high-speed rail. And so that starts to really transform how those places interact, what those economies might look like between Silicon Valley or even San Francisco and the Central Valley, and why we really see that valley-to-valley connection between the Central Valley and Silicon Valley as being the critical part where we start to really see the big benefits of the technology and the transportation mode, is because once you start to tie those places together, and I think you mentioned my kind of background in economics and geography, there's a concept called agglomeration economies in sort of urban economics literature, where that talks about once you increase accessibility, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts economically. And so you start to act as one big mega region that has a lot more connections than you would have today. And so that might create some commercial opportunities for maybe some Bay Area firms who right now are looking at, I don't know, Reno or Phoenix or somewhere else, and maybe have some of their functions in Central Valley, and that also provides opportunities for folks who are living in the Central Valley and who might have, for example, more affordable housing to work at jobs in Silicon Valley and the Bay Area. And I think those larger labor pools, larger opportunities for where folks can locate will create economic activity more broadly. And I think that's part of certainly the economic case for the project.
Yeah, I think it's funny when people think about high-speed rail, they sort of think about commuters first, and maybe freight and cargo second. But that regional tourism, to literally go to San Jose for dinner is an achievable thing, or to make a softball game in Gilroy is now potentially an achievable thing. So I think we have to think about that, not just 9 to 5 use, but how weekend use, it opens up the doors for a lot of different folks in California. Boris, unless you had any other kind of closing comment or reminder of how folks can participate and support high-speed rail, any final reminders?
No, again, I want to say thank you again to the Chamber, Rodney, you and Emily as well, for having us this morning. We do have still a lot of work to do in what we need to accomplish, and I guess I just want to reiterate, we're doing everything we can to bring high-speed rail to San Francisco as fast as possible, and we need all the support we can get to make that a reality, and certainly appreciate that the Chamber's been a big part of that over the years.
Great. Well, Boris, the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce has your support, and we support you. And going forward, we'll try to round up more updates like this if given the opportunity. So thank you for attending today, and thank you, Rebecca and Morgan. If we can go to the last slide, just a reminder that San Francisco Chamber of Commerce is a nonprofit organization, much like KQED. So all of you who are able to join us, and your support financially is so important through membership. We have very, very modest membership programs and opportunities and levels for people to get involved in. And of course, there is continued content that is coming out, as you see on the screen here. On the 4th, we have the small business focus. On the 4th, also, we have the Bay Area Sports Hall of Fame, and this should be pretty cool. This is an insight to how the business of Bay Area sports works, and we have leadership from each of our Bay Area sports teams talking about the challenges, but also the successes that the Bay Area has had with its sports teams. I'm talking about a conversation again with Dr. Rutherford from UCSF, and a chamber member mixer. So there's always an opportunity to meet other chamber members, to get involved, to hopefully make some business connections with each other. So with that, I want to thank you for joining this forum. Thank you again, Boris, and have a nice day, and we'll see you at the next one.